So Ryan Newkirk, PhD, MPH, is the Senior Advisor for the Intentional Adulteration at FDA and is a member of the Food Defense and Emergency Coordination staff at the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. He is the lead for the Food Safety Modernization Act Intentional Adulteration Rule Writing Work Group and is the co-lead for the group writing the rules guidance. Dr. Newkirk has worked in terrorism prevention for 20 years with a focus on food defense for more than 10 years. Prior to joining FDA, Dr. Newkirk held a postdoctoral position with USDA, Food Safety Inspection Service, Food Defense Assessment Staff. He completed his doctorate in epidemiology and food defense research at the Food Protection and Defense Institute at the University of Minnesota School of Public Health. So thank you, Ryan, for joining us. This is a very important topic, and it's not something that we've talked about a lot in the past, but it's certainly becoming more relevant every day. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will, you should be able to share yours.
Okay.
And we'll let you know how it looks.
Okay. How are we doing so far? Something coming up?
There, yep, we've got your screen.
Okay, let me make this
And
slideshow. Okay.
beautiful. Looks
Okay,
good.
great. All right. Well, thank you, Donna. And thanks for folks dialing in to the discussion today. Appreciate the intro there from Donna. So what I've got on deck here for the next session are some slides, some information on food defense on the dairy farm. And I'll note that this, I added to this title a little bit of a qualifier here. So an FDA perspective. You know, there's so much expertise out there in the private sector, trade associations, academia, other government agencies, et cetera, in this particular area. So the information that I'll present is, again, from FDA's perspective. So I broke out the presentation into these slides that we'll be discussing into 4 main components. Hopefully there'll be some themes and through lines. That's my intent, at least, for the information. But very briefly, a few slides on food defense, just level setting folks on what I mean when I say food defense. It has so many different definitions, and it just depends on who you ask. So some information on that, brief information on that, also FDA activities in this space and some private sector activities in this space. Then I'll connect that, or I'll attempt to connect that to what I call foundational work. So this is some really bedrock work that government, private sector, academia, et cetera, really ramped up about 20 years ago in terms of food defense. Prior to 2001, 9/11, there was some efforts, of course, to protect food against intentional adulteration, but that year, those events really ramped up efforts. So about 20 years now worth of really concentrated effort in this area. Linking that foundational work then to the Food Safety Modernization Act, and in particular, the Intentional Adulteration Rule. Describe some of the key pieces of that rule, and then relate that to the path forward for, or at least what I see as the potential path forward for continuing to protect milk on farm through a number of options. With that, let's dive right into some of the details here. So here's that level setting again that I mentioned. Food defense, again, a number of different definitions, but FDA on our food defense team's webpage, we describe food defense as the effort to protect food from acts of intentional adulteration. A lot of different underpinnings for that definition. It's changed a little bit throughout the years, but at a very high level, it is really boils down to this. And I will say that I really see food defense as a whole of nation effort. And so what I mean by that is to adequately and appropriately protect food and ag from intentional adulteration. It really does require investment and action from the private sector, government, academia, trade associations, really a whole of nation effort to do it right. Another theme that I'll include in this presentation is the dairy sector. The dairy sector has been an incredible leader in protecting food against intentional adulteration. And this harkens back to the early, 20 years ago, more than that. And so a nod here to all of the efforts that the private sector has put into protecting food, but particularly for our purposes today, really the dairy sector has been a leader. So a few examples of FDA activities in the food defense space. And before diving into those, two things on this slide. One, you'll see a hyperlink here, food defense, FDA food defense. There are a number of hyperlinks I included in the presentation to if folks are interested to get to certain documents or information or websites, et cetera. So you'll see some hyperlinks throughout the presentation. The other point here before the details is very important, and it's an overarching point. For FDA food defense activities, these are really built on collaborative efforts with the private sector, academia, and others. Government cannot do this work alone by any way, shape, or form, or any measure. And we have worked together in terms of collaborative efforts and protecting food from this type of adulteration. So that's the background and foundations for all of this work. So for the details, for some examples of FDA work for food defense, there are regulatory requirements specifically related to Fisma, and I'll talk more about those later. Our staff does guidance, training, a lot of outreach. Some of that is directly related to those regulatory requirements, and some is related to voluntary approaches. There's a lot of activity under non-regulatory frameworks that go into protecting food from intentional adulteration. You'll hear me also talk a lot about vulnerability assessments and mitigation strategies. These are the bedrocks of food defense work, things that we've done for, again, about 20 years now, really forming solid scientific foundations for everything that's happened in this space, at least in terms of government, everything that's happened in this space for a while. Tools and resources, a lot of information on our web pages related to tools and resources. One particular example that I like to highlight is what we call the Food Defense Plan Builder. It's a software program, downloadable, free for folks. It helps entities walk through creating a food defense plan. We built that during pre-Fisma time frame, so under voluntary frameworks. We built this with incredible input from industry partners, and so this is a pretty popular tool. I've mentioned the voluntary framework a few times already. Really important action here, again, before regulatory requirements were on stage. This was collaborative efforts, really working together to figure out the best ways to protect food against intentional adulteration. And a lot of these efforts continue today. Research activities in these areas and interagency efforts and coordination. So everybody's well aware that as food moves from farm to table, there are a lot of different entities and government entities as well that touch on the food space. And so with something as complicated and complex as the food and ag system and getting folks safe food, there's a lot of interagency efforts and coordination that happens, and that applies to the food defense area as well. So moving into private sector work here, you'll see a lot of the of similar things that I just had under FDA's work. There's significant efforts related to voluntary protection of food, both pre-Fisma and now. Regulatory compliance for some, so folks under the entities under the Fisma intentional adulteration rule, there are requirements there, but there are exemptions. One big one that we'll talk about later in this presentation. So not everyone, of course, is required. Those exemptions and exceptions. So many of those stakeholders are continuing with voluntary efforts. Very important. Again, vulnerability assessments and mitigation strategies, those bedrock activities, some in industry, some stakeholders do that outside of any regulatory requirements. Tools and resources, some stem directly from private sector activities, including some dairy specific information that some trade associations have worked on and put out a while ago. Research, again, some of these activities stem from wholly private sector activities, some more collaborative with government, and there are dairy specific activities that have occurred. I'll just hit on that collaboration piece again, and then note as well, the dairy sector just really being one of the leaders in this area, worth noting, worth repeating. So those were fairly quick slides on what food defense is in general, a few activities by government, a few activities by the private sector. Transitioning here a little bit into what I call foundational work, and really these are important activities that some of them started a little less than 20 years ago that really set the path, really gave us some strong science upon which to build subsequent activities, including regulatory activities. So I'll hit on 4 pieces here in what I call the foundational work. Homeland Security Presidential Directive 9. This was signed by President Bush and finalized in public in early 2004. Really important to protect the nation's food and ag from intentional adulteration. For the first time, it established a national policy to defend food and ag against terrorist attacks, disasters, and emergencies. So critically, this brought government, private sector, academia, a number of players together to get a sense of what are the vulnerabilities in the nation's system, food and ag system, and how do we go about closing those vulnerabilities as much as possible. That's where those vulnerability assessment and mitigation strategies components come in. And as I mentioned, this really did lay the foundation for future efforts up to today, as well as in the near and midterm and longer, looking out over the horizon. One really important program early on after the directive was finalized and signed was the Strategic Partnership Program, Agroterrorism. An interesting acronym there or title there. So the SPA program is how we refer to that. Really starting to put the pieces together from requirements and mandates that was in the directive on the previous slide. Collaboration here between quite a few federal departments and agencies. So FDA, USDA, Homeland Security, FBI, among others, were key players. State governments and critically private sector entities. And so in a critical infrastructure, food and ag is one of the 16 critical infrastructures. In a critical infrastructure, in food and ag in particular, it's about over 95% owned or held in private hands, private ownership. And so to get our hands around or get a better sense of vulnerabilities and ways to close those vulnerabilities, we could not have done this without this incredible effort from the private sector, bringing everyone to the table, getting a lot of expertise around in those discussions, and really working through some of these tough issues. At a very high level, what we had done, or what was done in this program, were to bring all those folks together with experience and expertise, conduct vulnerability assessments on quite a few commodities, and definitely including dairy commodities. Some of this was, around a table. Some of this was manufacturing and processing facilities, walking through those. Other times it was looking at transportation type nodes. So a lot of activity here, getting a handle on vulnerabilities as well as protective strategies. And we'll go through those two last bullets here in the next few slides. So as I've mentioned a couple times, vulnerability assessments really are kind of the primary way that we use to get a better sense of vulnerability writ large, and in particular for commodities and point steps or procedures in the food system. What the interagency decided on, so there are a number of different ways, number of different methods for vulnerability assessment, and what the federal interagency decided on early on in this program was to settle on one method. So Carver plus shock was the method that we used. Originally, this was a military targeting tool, and we kind of turned it on its head to be more protective in nature and look for vulnerabilities that we could close. So Carver is an acronym. Those factors spelled out there on the slide for you. This method is commodity-based, so from farm to table, or sometimes from a manufacturer's kind of a generalized manufacturing type process, looking at each of those points that the particular commodity moves through. Having experts around the table or in the facility or wherever the assessment, that part of the assessment was, looking at these factors that are on the screen and then scoring them, deciding on scores. So scores were 1 to 10, 10 being the most vulnerable. Doing this for each of the steps under assessment, adding the scores up for each of these factors for each of those points. And the points or steps with the largest sum score, those were the most vulnerable points. Lots of discussion related to how the scores shook out. Some would say, this is the highest. Some would say, no, this is medium. And so discussions on how to settle on those scores. So this is the way we use the most to get a handle on vulnerable points to intentional adulteration in the food system by commodities. Really critical work here. We've been doing this, government and partners have been doing this for quite a while now, as I've mentioned. And so one thing that FDA did a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, maybe at this point, longer than that, probably, time is starting to get away from me here, was that we combined the vulnerability assessment data and analyzed that data together. Some of this analysis was critical, and one really important thing that we determined from this analysis was we identified what we call key activity types. Key activity types are really interesting and from my perspective, incredibly helpful in terms of thinking through protecting food from intentional adulteration. These things are general groups of manufacturing, processing, sometimes transportation steps that scored high in terms of vulnerability. So that vulnerability scoring I just walked through, scored high in terms of vulnerability, regardless of commodity being assessed. And so that last part is key. So regardless of commodity being assessed, we identified groups of activities that scored high in terms of vulnerability. Really important component to this work. Those key activity types, there are 4 of them. Bulk liquid receiving and loading, liquid storage and handling, secondary ingredient handling, and then mixing and similar activities. And so this is another way to conduct a vulnerability assessment. What happens here is that you have, so if you're a manufacturer processor, you've got your flow diagrams with all your point steps or procedures from receiving to loading. You have the 4 key activity types with a description that's included in guidance on FDA's website. You have those 2 pieces of paper together, and it's matching. It's basically a matching exercise. So if one of your points deals with bulk liquid receiving and loading, FDA argues that you have what we call a significant vulnerability that needs to have some mitigation efforts then be put in place at or around it. So more on this later. I did underline those 2 first ones because they will pop up here in the coming slides. So vulnerability assessments, regardless of the method, what you're doing there is you're identifying your most vulnerable points. Kind of on the flip side of this activity then, or the flip side of this work, is to identify ways to close those vulnerabilities, reduce those vulnerabilities, maybe even in some cases eliminate those vulnerabilities. A ton of work done here, continues to be done here, again, through that collaborative effort from the private sector, academia, government, et cetera. I'll go down, I'll first start with the Food Defense Mitigation Strategies database bullet here. So this is also a popular tool that FDA has on its website. What we've done here is we've created this database. It's searchable by keyword and or node in the food system. So for example, if you are looking at wanting to get ideas for mitigation strategies for silos, you can type in silo and the database will return results, sometimes 20 or more results for strategies that we've worked with our private sector and academic partners to identify those strategies. I do encourage folks to kind of play around with the mitigation strategies database, use it as a tool for identifying strategies that may work in the area business that you have expertise in. I'll note that these strategies are not commodity specific. And so they apply, again, the vulnerabilities are more those points, steps, or procedures that food moves through from farm to table. It's not inherent to particular commodities. And so mitigation strategies follow that similar thinking. Strategies are not inherent to particular commodities, but they can apply to those point steps or procedures that are vulnerable. So they can apply to dairy commodities. There's just not specific strategies for dairy. Now I'll jump back up to this kind of middle bullet here, this hyperlink for food security preventive measures. I went back and forth when I was drafting the slides on whether to include this particular bullet, mainly because this information is dated at this point. FDA put this information up on our website quite a few years ago, definitely pre-Fisma. So a number of areas in the document does have dated information. However, I did decide to include this. It's can be a bit difficult to find on the website, but also if it helps folks think through or brainstorm different ways to continue to protect milk as it moves from farm to table, then that's the whole point of having the guidance in the first place. So for anybody that's interested in that, please do check that information out. So now kind of level setting for food defense and activities, then with the description of foundational work, including vulnerability assessments and mitigation strategies and a lot of analysis we've done in identifying those strategies. Let's shift to Fisma now. Everybody has heard quite a bit about Fisma, included some of the biggest changes to FDA's food authorities for quite some time. Fisma is about 10 years old. So it's been around now for a while. Particular for this presentation, we'll focus on the statutory authority that the law provided to FDA to protect foods under FDA's jurisdiction from intentional adulteration. So 7 foundational rules came out of Fisma. The last of the 7 was the intentional adulteration rule. I'll note for our purposes, importantly, what the law, one of the things that the law did for the intentional adulteration authority was to exempt farms. However, it did not exempt dairy farms. So FDA took that statutory authority and we drafted, proposed, and then finalized regulations. And so the intentional adulteration rule, we published the proposed rule very late 2013, and a few items related to that rule. We laid out a lot of our thinking, of course, in that rule and some proposed requirements, but some of the main things we did were we summarized our analysis. We summarized that experience and analysis that I've already talked about today on the of the vulnerability assessments. We described those key activity types. We linked them to, if there's a presence of a key activity type, then there's the presence of what we call a significant vulnerability. Those vulnerabilities, per the requirements of the rule, have to be reduced. So there's some important pieces here that we laid out in the proposed rule. We described proposed requirements, and so for food manufacturers and processors, we laid out proposed requirements for somewhat similar to a HACCP type program. So there was a proposed requirement for a food defense plan that consisted of a facility-specific vulnerability assessment followed by mitigation strategies for any of those significant vulnerabilities. And then monitoring corrective actions and verification to ensure that those mitigation strategies are in fact doing what they're supposed to. Records requirements and training requirements as well in that proposed rule. You'll remember that I mentioned that the law, so Fisma did exempt farms from the intentional adulteration requirements. However, it did not exempt dairy farms. So there was a carve out of the exemption there. And so in the proposed intentional adulteration rule, we did dedicate some preamble space there to our thinking and with questions for dairy farms and intentional adulteration. And in this section, we identified those 2 key activity types that I had underlined on the earlier slide. We identified those the presence of those on dairy farms and talked about some details for that. So again, liquid storage and handling and bulk liquid receiving and loading were the 2 KATs we identified in the preamble, mostly around the milk silo, not 100%, but mostly, and talked about some of those, or not talked about, but outlined some of our thinking there in the preamble section here on dairy farms. We requested in that document a lot of feedback. We asked a lot of questions in this section of the proposed rule. We asked questions all over the proposed rule, but more so in this section of the preamble than others. Those questions can be grouped into some main categories with important categories here on the bottom of the slide. We asked about current protective practices that farms, co-ops, stakeholders, et cetera, have to protect milk on farms, any type of training program or education program or awareness training stakeholders, dairy farm stakeholders are using or aware of on farms, and then the scope of potential requirements. And so that was tied somewhat to other areas of Fisma requiring different kinds of thinking for small, very small entities, et cetera. A few questions there related to like herd size, dollar amount of milk being sold on an annual basis, et cetera. It's probably no surprise that we generated significant feedback there from our questions on the proposed rule. And while, in particular for dairy farms, and while this is not an exhaustive list of what we heard or groupings of comments that we heard, I think these are important to kind of set the stage for some of our thinking and how we moved forward. There were some comments that did agree that it's very important to protect milk while on farms, including through regulatory requirements. These comments, almost all of these comments then went further and noted that it, in their opinions, would be very difficult to significantly reduce access by mitigation strategies that do that on farms. There were also comments that stated their belief that there was no risk of intentional adulteration on farms or very low risk. And these comments summarized some of that thinking into statements about there was no need for requirements, these types of requirements on farm because of the no to low risk. Some comments responded to our questions about current protective efforts on farms with providing some examples, signage and restrictions, restricted access to the farm in general, et cetera. Some comments noted, there are stakeholders for dairy farms that do have a voluntary approach for protecting milk while on farm, noting that those stakeholders have been successful, so that should continue. We asked in the proposed rule if there was an option that if there were no mitigation strategies, such as reducing access to certain parts of dairy farms or pieces of equipment on dairy farms, if a training only requirement would work. And so there was some comments that talked through their thinking on that. And two very important kind of groupings, related groupings of comments that really informed our path forward as well, was that a number of comments said FDA needs to gather more information in this particular topic area and further engage with stakeholders, including NCIMS. NCIMS was the most frequently mentioned stakeholder for comments that noted further engagement is needed. So those two last bullets there were really important as we thought through what we heard from the comment period and the comments on the rule, and as we finalized the intentional adulteration rule. Lots of thinking, lots of options we considered from those comments. So we did finalize the IA rule, and that went public in the middle of 2016. The requirements in the rule are for manufacturers and processors, very similar to what I laid out from the proposed rule, for defense plan, vulnerability assessments, mitigation, et cetera. So those are requirements for manufacturers and processors. Importantly, we finalized the rule with no requirements for dairy farms. So no requirements under the IA rule for dairy farms. What we did do in the preamble of that final rule was described FDA's thinking after reviewing the comments, thinking through options, et cetera. And while this slide is a little bit of abuse of PowerPoint, and sorry for that, but this text was really important with a tremendous amount of thought and effort put into it from the preamble of the final rule. So what we described here, again, this is from that rule, is that we thought mitigation strategies that restricted access to milk while on farms, those strategies are warranted based on the risk of an intentional adulteration event on farms. However, at the time of rule finalization and considering all the input through the public comment process as well as experience many years prior to that, we could not identify strategies that limited access to milk that are appropriate and practical to require. So we did agree with those commenters that talked about further dialogue and engagement. So we agreed that that was important and that collaborative efforts with stakeholders, particularly NCIMS and the stakeholders they can bring to the table, we needed that to identify and develop strategies that are protective and practical. And this is the most appropriate path forward to address what our concerns are for intentional adulteration on farms in the near term, as strategies that can limit access are developed in the long term. So that was 2016. So where does that leave us in terms of intentional adulteration and protecting milk farms? Well, the path forward here, at least in the context of what I've laid out from previous food defense efforts through the Fisma rulemaking, we FDA requested, sent a letter requesting a formation of a food defense study committee for dairy farms to the NCIMS chair and executive board. And I'll note that the executive board did approve that study committee. Really big, important step there. NCIMS is leading this effort. They're an amazing stakeholder here, and them leading this is really important. There's 14 members on the committee, great representation from the private sector, knowledgeable folks, very experienced. Same can be said about the state regulators that are on the committee, and then there's a handful of FDA personnel, and we're functioning more so as advisors on this committee. I'll also note, again with the theme of collaboration, the committee is collaborative by design. FDA took the comments, all the comments to the proposed rule very seriously, but particularly for this topic, the engagement with stakeholders, the collaborative nature of moving forward to identify ways to continue and increase protection of milk while on farm. So that collaborative nature is critical here. The committee, what the committee is doing, two kind of main objectives related to mitigation strategies, one related to training. First of all, the committee is going to get their hands around the universe of potential strategies. So identifying those potential strategies that could be implemented on farms. Following that, there'll be an evaluation of those strategies. How viable are some of these, are these strategies that have been identified? And some key considerations to determine that viability or to think through that viability. For these strategies, what are the current practices on farms and the impact that these potential strategies may have on farm operations? So if you lock down the entire milk house of the farm on the dairy farm, that is not going to work, right? You cannot lock the entire milk house on the farm. That milk house requires access by animals, by personnel, supplies, et cetera. There's piping. So really thinking through some of those strategies and how it will impact farm operations. Somewhat related, but also independent consideration for regulatory compliance with existing requirements, right? Lots of states have all states have requirements for dairy farms. Some of that involves access to areas of the farm and pieces of equipment of the farm. So what are these potential strategies? How do those interact with that? Perceived feasibility and estimated costs, also important considerations when working through these activities. And then the objective related to training. So identify any food defense awareness training activities that could be relevant to farms. So it doesn't have to currently be solely focused on farms, but that could be relevant to farms. And for those activities identified, identify potential gaps in those trainings. So really following a path of where we've been prior regarding mitigation strategies, regarding training, and just thinking through ways to better protect food from intentional adulteration. And of course, in this particular committee, we're focused on dairy farms and how we can continue to protect milk on farms here. So where does all of this lead us? I mean, it was food defense writ large kind of descriptions, foundational work, Fisma, and all that came out of that, as well as now collaborative efforts with NCIMS other regulators, and industry folks. I see some paths forward here. Related paths can do this in combination. We'll just have to see for some of this, but a continuation with the voluntary efforts to protect milk on farms. There's no reason to alter those unless folks, stakeholders decide to increase those. Those efforts for entities that have done this and implemented these efforts, really important. So continue those. That theme of collaboration, we've seen it work time and time again between government, private sector, academia. So absolutely continue that. Hopefully you've heard quite a few examples from these slides on how that's worked and what we've been able to do through that work and based on the results of that work. And then very important here, a deep consideration of and respect for the NCIMS committee work. Once that is completed, that will be a critical piece of how we move forward. The cake is not baked here. And so what the committee does here, I think, will be very informative. So lots of ways to continue to protect milk while on farm. It's really important, of course, that we do so, as well as with all the other commodities, food and ag being critical to our daily lives. And so it warrants strong protection. And however best that protection is done, let's collaborate and figure that out together. So with that, I believe that's my last slide. So I will open it up to questions. I kind of lost track of the time, so not sure how much time we have, but I think we've got some time for questions.
Yeah, we certainly thank you, Ryan, for that presentation. We appreciate it, and we'll be looking to hear more from the NCIMS committee. Do you know, will they be meeting at the conference in April or presenting in April? Do you know?
I know that the committee was really looking at the April conference, and I am not sure. I would defer to the committee on timing for some things, but I know that April is an important time frame for some activities. But I could follow up with the committee on that if that would be helpful.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if they were going to have at least some preliminary things that they could present. Sure. If there's anybody else that has a question, jump in. Otherwise, I'll start. I know you said that you're looking at things that are appropriate, practical, and protective.
Right.
What and locking the milk house at all times is not one of those things.
No.
What are you looking at?
Yeah, so we use a lot of our experience from other areas in the food sector, manufacturers, processors, input, of course, from the private sector, trade associations. And so some of the types of mitigation strategies could apply here. So thinking has progressed for mitigation strategies from pre to post, as you could imagine. And so during that process, we started to identify categories of strategies. One category is more personnel based. So more eyes on a vulnerable point, more traffic through certain areas, trusted people in critical areas. So there's a lot that could be kind of thought through and applied to dairy farms there. The other kind of large category or higher level category of strategies that we've identified is what we call technology assisted strategies. That is admittedly not the best term. So those things could include things like padlocks. They could include things that are more sophisticated like cameras or something like that. These are very important also for the committee to consider, but we do know for sure we cannot lock the milk out. I mean, that's just unworkable. And so thinking through some other ways to potentially restrict access will be important.
Good, thank you. Are there any other questions? People, you can raise your hand, unmute yourself. You can type in the chat box. If not, that's good. I'll take the screen back. Thank you, Ryan.
Sure.
And
Thank you.
I'm sure we'll be hearing more from you, or if not you, from somebody about this. It's coming. So thanks.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you.